the questions come into my head and go straight out.
I know that feeling.
So you did a interesting podcast yesterday with a guy from Gunworks, which was focused sort of on long-range shooting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I could sum up what it was complicated and hard to track, and I got the impression that it was advocating for both using match bullets, and is that right? But also sort of extending our ideas of what is ethical in terms of long-range shooting. And he talked about his son shooting his first bull elk at 1,400 yards.
Nearly, yeah.
And yeah, nearly 1,400 yards. And I was sort of blown away by this. And it's, how do we balance this the ever expanding technological ability giving us, greater and greater ability to kill things? Not for me, but for people who are able to use it properly. I'm not capable. But it seems like a necessary corollary is that there's going to be decreased opportunity as these things increase. And as a community, do we ever have to take a stance and begin there are types of self-regulation. It feels like the hunting community can't self-regulate at the speed that technology develops, but this isn't my wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a real can of worms, and I'm kind of glad you brought it up. There are some state regulations that are starting to take note and regulate things such as trail cameras and some levels of technology. In that rifle world, it's funny, I had a conversation earlier this week about a friend about how Idaho used to be a destination for giant mule deer bucks. People would come from all over, and they'd drive out in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. You could buy 2 mule deer buck tags over the counter, and they'd go, and you can find pictures in books and old auto shops and whatnot of giant bucks these guys are pulling out. And this friend and I were talking about, okay, well, what are some of the reasons that we don't have these now? I mean, there's so many various factors, but one of them was the long-range rifles and the laser rangefinders and all that. And we kind of both joked and then sobered up and said very, with commitment that, yeah, if we could do it, we'd say, all right, lever action 30-30s with iron sights only across the whole state. Yeah. Everybody'd have lots of opportunity, plenty of time in the field. Very few people would shoot deer. But those big bucks had come back. And for the people that wanted to really work on their true hunting skills, they'd shoot deer every year, and they'd eventually start bringing home some of those tremendous 8- and 9-year-old deer that we just don't see anymore, right?
I'm not sure that very few people would shoot deer. I think our expectation, certainly we'd have to work harder and develop more skills. With a 1,300-yard shot, I'm hesitant to restrict what other people can do because I don't want my own stuff to be restricted. But I do think there has to be a line drawn where, first of all, the anti-hunters see that, and it's a very easy case for them to make that this is not fair chase, and it's no one's romantic idea of hunting to kill an animal from 1,300 yards.
I'll actually differ with you there. So humans are humans, and every one of us is individual, right? So some of us believe or know that we get the greatest fulfillment from stalking close enough to see the whites of their eyes and the steam coming off a bull elk when he bugles, and shoot them with a longbow, right? Others, their passion is more engineering and mechanical oriented in their mind, and making a very precise ethical shot at a very long distance is where it's at for those guys. So from my perspective, I've always felt like I want to be the best hunter I can, so I don't have to take long shots, and at the same time the best rifleman I can, so that if I have to take a long shot, I can do so ethically. And if I have to help clean up after a friend has made a mistake and a poor hit, I can help him with that, even if it's 800, 900, 1,000 yards or more. So I work very hard on both those skills to try and become a very good hunter and a very good rifleman. I've always been a proponent of tough, controlled expansion bullets. Like, the bullet is so important that the specific projectile is the only true connecting factor between you and your quarry, right? Your rifle's the launching pad. It's very important. Your skills, your riflemanship, your marksmanship, that's the driver behind the whole package. But the only thing that literally connects you with your game is your bullet. And I've always believed in using the best bullet I can to give me the most ethical capability at any shot angle. And there are some modern designated hunting bullets that are really good at that. The reason I brought Aaron Davidson on, he's the founder and owner of Gunworks, which is the driving factor in precision or long-range hunting today. Right? Their company has been the biggest ambassadors, the biggest educators in that field for over a decade. Very admirably good at what they do. The reason I brought Aaron on is because I don't know anybody with his amount of experience in that realm. And I wanted to bring his opinions and expertise, which are often candidly opposing to my own, onto the show and just hear him out. That's why I didn't debate him on any of those topics. I just wanted to hear what's worked for him. When somebody tells you they've either taken or seen taken, like been right there over the shoulder of the shooter, helping them out with wind calls and stuff, more than 500 animals taken at long range with a given bullet, that is a level of expertise you cannot debate, right? There's too much data and evidence and experience there. Now, I still, disagree with what he would use inside, let's call it 300 or 400 yards. I think there are bullets that are way better than a target type bullet for use at closer range, but his lifelong goal has been to extend his lethal ethical capability at extreme distances, right? That's the way he's wired. That's his primary motivation. He gets so much fulfillment out of it. Where the danger comes in is promoting that to people who just want to kill more stuff. And they're not willing to go through the candidly very arduous steps to achieve ethical levels of lethality at those distances. I've seen a lot of guys with a $10,000 shooting rig shoot at something at 600 and 700 yards and hit it poorly. You've got to live, breathe, eat, and dream long-range shooting on all levels, not just at game, to be, to actually go into that and have some ethics in your method.
Yeah, no, something that I think a point that you've consistently made in your podcast is that if your passion is long-range shooting, then it's, ethical and viable to shoot things at distance. And I totally buy that. The only thing is that my experience with people shooting out to, there's sort of been a normalization of shooting at what I consider extreme distance. And they go, oh, Kyle, well, you can't shoot for shit. Well, that's why it's extreme distance. But even so, I think when you're getting out past 500 yards to 1,000 yards, that's far. And it's so far that you're oftentimes shooting with very little chance for the animal to know that you're there. That's okay, but most of the people I've met who are shooting at those distances are not people who have devoted their life to long range shooting. They're people who sort of have this normalized expectation that 500 to 1,000 yards is doable because I've got this, sub MOA rifle. And then they go and they're shooting, 15 shots, and so it's a tricky thing. At a certain point, we do have to limit things. For instance, if I told you I love drones, like drones are my passion, and there's nothing I like more than putting some explosive on a drone and expertly flying that drone 1.5 miles and crashing it into a bull elk and harvesting that bull elk, we'd both sort of accept that that's not okay, right? There is a place for the larger community to put limits on things, and I think it's an ongoing conversation about what those limits are. It seems like the conversation perhaps doesn't move fast enough for the advances in technology. Yeah,
technology is evolving right now so fast. I don't think our intellects and our ethics can keep up. It's an unfortunate thing. I like something you said several minutes ago about you don't like regulating anybody else's choices, right? So I think this is something I've tried to do through my podcast and my writing, and whatever small amount of influence I have on the hunting public is to try and instill a sense of personal responsibility. because it's so easy for a chap to run down to the local gun shop and drop $3,000 on a really nice rifle that's going to shoot tiny groups, and $2,000 on a top-end scope, and then buy a case of this really good precision hunting ammunition and put it all together and fire up his ballistic app and go shoot at some rocks out to 1,200 yards and then say, I'm ready. Mm-hmm. And they go out and they'll find a big buck across a canyon 800 or 900 yards away and go to shooting. And like you say, sometimes 15 shots later, they get the job done. And that's not okay. Where do we go with this? How do we help people understand this? There's so many factors. When you see that buck, your heart rate is going to jump through the sky, right? You're going to have massive quantities of adrenaline dumped onto your brain from excitement. You're probably already at high elevation and fatigued from pushing to try and get to a shooting position. So your muscles are stressed and trembling. Your focus is suffering because of reduced oxygen reaching your brain. So, and there may be a rapidly closing window of opportunity. So all these factors just compress, and they tend to, as I like to sometimes say, they let the puppy in the back of your brain drive, and you make some poor decisions sometimes. I think what we have to do is help people first understand that just because you have a scope with a dial on it and some expensive ammunition and an expensive rifle doesn't mean you have the right to try and see if you can make that rifle do what it can do. You have to know before you ever take on an endeavor like that you are capable of using that rifle to its full potential. How do you do that? Hundreds of rounds downrange, and not just at a shooting range off a bench, but this is something you can't do in the East or the Midwest unless you own a big piece of property. But here in the West, where we've got public ground, you can get out and you can hike trails somewhere not with a lot of people, right? Because you don't want to bother folks, but hike trails, glass up rocks at distance, and shoot in varying wind conditions, in weird positions, at extreme angles. Literally hundreds and hundreds of rounds should go through your rifle doing that before you ever take a shot at a live animal. And then you have to have an idea of what your maximum capability is. And this is just my personal experience, but I believe that every 200 yards, once you get past 600, doubles the difficulty of that shot. So an 800-yard shot, in my experience, on let's say a deer's vital size area, at least twice as hard as a 600-yard shot. And then a 1,000-yard shot is at least twice as hard as a 800-yard shot. So it's an exponentially more challenging effort. And candidly, most folks should never attempt it.
And how do we sort of pass down that knowledge and that system of values? And I think it's what you're saying about Louis L'Amour. Your values are to some extent grown out of the culture that produced you, and you're now playing a role in creating the current culture. And it seems hard for that culture to keep up, but I'm also filled with positivity by the fact that these podcasts are growing and having such success, in that it's building a new culture in order to inculcate, the values that we now need for ethical hunting, and also more than just ethical hunting. Like, in order to live, we need to see the world in a valued way, and it's very difficult being in a world in which values are murky.
Yeah. Oh, so difficult. I think it's a wonderful thing that mankind, humans, are optimists in general. And when you see a great big buck and you have a nice rifle, your optimism is often bigger than it should be, right? And you think, he's at 700 yards, but if I don't take this shot, I'm never going to get another chance, right? And so people will lay down, people that have never shot past 300 or 400 yards, and throw a bullet. Pre-visioning, like envisioning and mentally playing that out ahead of time, is important to being able to resist that temptation. I've been guilty of it in my younger days. I know a lot of people that are guilty of that, and the size of the potential reward sometimes will make us take substantial risks, and we have to set our ethics in advance before we can expect ourselves to react appropriately in that situation. If we don't have that rule set ahead of time, we're not going to generate it in the moment. We're too optimistic for that, right?
Yes, that's
Now,
a good point.
There's an episode from several years back of Meat Eater wherein Steven Rinella is laying down prone somewhere here in Idaho, and he's aiming at a big deer. This is a bona fide Boone and Crockett buck that's 407 yards away. And if memory serves, he doesn't take the shot, and a minute later, talking to the buck gets away, right? A minute or so later, he's talking to the camera, and he says, my self-imposed maximum distance is 400 yards, and the buck was too far. To me, that was foolish. 7 yards isn't enough to worry about, right? He'd have killed that deer just fine. I'm not sure what the point of that exercise was. However, on the plus side, several days later, he ended up shooting a non-typical buck that was even bigger at something like 370 yards, killed it cleanly, right? And so whether you believe in karma or simple hard work, or the fact that, if you really take a hard and fast stance on your ethics, it will eventually reward you. That's all up to you, right? But I do think that if we work hard, we can also cut ourselves a little bit of slack. 7 yards wouldn't have saved that deer's life.
But you understand where he's coming from, because 7 yards, he's drawn a sort of arbitrary line, but there's a need to stick to it just because 7 yards, well, what if I could shoot at 407, why not 414 and 421? And that slippery slope, but obviously in an organic, it's a great point that you made about sort of setting your lines beforehand, or at least setting your ethical codes before you go into the field. I'm a big proponent of sort of deciding things in the present moment, but in this situation, I'm smiling because when I first got here, I started elk hunting, and I had the cow tag, and I hunted it in the snow for 7 days straight. And on the last day, the final day of the season, I took a 500-yard shot, and I'd never shot past 300 yards, and it was a terrible mistake. And I spent 3 days tracking that elk, and I think it was okay, but it was just completely foolish, and I felt terrible, and I didn't have my ethics, and my rules weren't prefigured before I went into the field. This year, I saw the biggest buck I've ever seen on opening morning, and I didn't have my rangefinder. I left it on the other side of the ridge. And, just thinking, it's first light, and in that first light, the light is kind of murky. It's hard to judge distance. And I thought, oh, he's far. I don't know. I don't want to take a shot without ranging him. I thought, I'm just going to let him walk off, and I'll go around and find him. I never saw that buck again. But I don't feel, sort of a smug about it in that, oh, what a, moral decision. I wish I had killed that buck. And in hindsight, having ranged it, I wish I had shot that buck. Yeah. But I'm glad that not knowing that in the situation I didn't.
You made the right decision, yeah. So let's talk about what should a good hunter be able to achieve, right, with his rifle, because we've been throwing around ethics and what's too far and what's,
ground us.
Yeah. So just to touch on this for a minute or two, what should we expect of ourselves as hunters now? So one of the great hunters of yesteryear was Jack O'Connor. He was an extremely good rider, very capable rifleman, and he did a lot of shooting to 400 yards and sometimes beyond. But based on his writings and my own experience before rangefinders and dial-up scopes, and just reading, researching, and watching serious hunters of the past, a really good rifleman 30 years ago could pull off a 400-yard shot reliably, okay? You're making a very good range estimate, because that was before your laser rangefinders came around, right? You had to get within 50 yards or so on your estimate, and then you had to know your trajectory and the way your rifle behaved and so forth. Then we got laser rangefinders, so now we can know within, even if we're shaky, within 5 or 10 yards of how far our quarry is, even if it's 1,000 yards, right? Following on that, we got dial-up scopes and ballistic calculators on our smartphones that can tell us exactly how to compensate for any trajectory, as long as you put your inputs in there, your velocity and your bullet type, your altitude and so forth correctly. Then we got laser rangefinders that combine an atmospheric sensor with a ballistic calculator, and you upload your ballistics to that. When you range it, it'll kick out a dial-up solution for your scope. We have overcome the distance compensation problem. We don't have to judge range. We don't have to wonder where our bullet's going to hit, okay? Then premium modern bullets have come along and minimized wind deflection so that you can, because wind is not still the joker in the deck. You can't plug a wind into a ballistic calculator if you don't know what that wind is. Wind is variable. It's always fluctuating. And there are often multiple vectors between you and the animal or target you're going to shoot at. And you have to factor all those things in. So modern bullets help minimize that tremendously. Less wind drift means a greater hit percentage, right? And this is something that Aaron Davidson was talking about is so crucial to long-range shooting. You combine all those factors, I believe that a modern rifleman with a really good rifle, a really good optic, and really good ammunition in his scope that knows how to use a rangefinder and a ballistic calculator properly can be a very ethical 600-yard shooter. This is my opinion, right? I don't see why anybody that dedicates themselves can't achieve that. 600 yards to me is now the new 400 yards. But there is a caveat to this. You have to have practical experience. If you're coming from Minnesota and you've never shot past 100 yards, even if you have all the toys, don't be taking a 600-yard shot till you've spent some time doing 600-yard shots on steel targets or rocks or whatever. But that's kind of the fundamental capability that I think most serious hunters who are also serious riflemen can achieve. For your average guy that doesn't want to deal with all the technology, I think, on my podcast I preach quarter-mile capability. A serious backcountry hunter should be able to shoot a quarter mile ethically and competently. Quarter mile is, of course, 440 yards. Let's call it 450 yards. If you can shoot that far, you're going to take good advantage of 90% of the hunting opportunities you have in the backcountry.
So we can shoot ethically and well at 600 yards. We can shoot ethically and well at 440. Should we? We eventually have to make a decision. I guess it's an individual decision, and I think we both think that leave it up to the individual as much as possible, but sort of we're exploring these and not going to put this on anyone. Is there a point at which you feel that you begin to lose part of the experience of hunting, or are you pretty much like, oh, it's a equal and opposite exchange? So at 1,200 yards, you've got as much fulfillment. It's just from a different thing.
That's a great question, and I think it depends a lot on the individual and how we're wired. I love hunting with a longbow in thick timber and trying to call elk. That is such a different experience from sitting on a ridge and glassing a couple of harems of elk across the canyon, trying to find a really good bull and make a clean, ethical shot on them. That is just as fulfilling to watch the interplay of the herds and the elk and so forth, for me. But there are people that are wired all one way or all the other way. And I think as long as you work hard to achieve true ethical lethality, whether it's making a 20-yard shot with a longbow, which is hard for me, or a 600-yard shot with a modern precision hunting rifle, I'm fine with either one. And as far as whether or not we should, I think we have to face the fact that even those of us, like myself, being dragged kicking and screaming into the current scene with social media and smartphones and so forth, we are modern man collectively. And it behooves us to make the most of our capabilities and the tools that are offered us. And if I then choose to go home and pull a Ruger No. 1 single shot out of my cabinet, chambered in .257 Roberts, and go deer hunting with a self-imposed 150-yard maximum range, great. I'm choosing a certain type of hunting and the experience that comes with that, right? If I then take my little girl out who had a knee operation 2 weeks before the hunting season, this is a fact, we did this, and she could only walk with crutches and that about 10 steps. We went out on the four-wheeler, we found a big ridge, and we glassed the biggest buck I saw all last season up the last day of the hunt, kind of like your elk, right? It was 1,411 yards. And Audrey is a phenomenal shot. She's the best shot of all my kids. All of her animals so far she's killed with a single shot. And I had my best long-range rifle there. And she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she looked at that deer again through the spotting scope, and humbly, tentatively, she said, "How far can that rifle shoot?" She wanted so bad to try that shot. There was no way to get closer. Yeah. The terrain, the timing, the buck was on his way to a big, deep, dark canyon where he was going to bed, right? I explained the situation to her, and we collectively both agreed this wasn't going to happen. That was way past our ethical limits. The conversation was fun though. It was enlightening to her. It was good for me to be able to try and show her why the ethics were in question at this point. If that buck had been 600 yards away, she'd have killed it, okay? But 1,400 yards, not gonna happen with me, even with my very best rifle and time to set up, right? Now, on the flip side, let's go back to you. You know, you've said most of what you've learned about rifles and rifle hunting and so forth has been from my podcast.
I don't know what that is.
So, on that premise, if I had been able to go with you on that cow elk hunt, and the day before I'd handed you that same rifle that Audrey and I had, and spent a half hour with you, shooting from field positions at targets to 600 yards, you would have killed that cow elk with a shot on the X. Especially if I'd been there to kneel in the snow beside you and coach you through it.
Yeah. And
it's 100% doable, and you'd have elk meat in your freezer.
And I think, at least where I'm at, the difference between 300 yards and 500 yards is that it's 500 yards, you're sometimes shooting cross canyon. And
usually, probably.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of put it into context, that year I messed up, and I came at the next season with a sort of burning fervor to do it right. And I shot an elk at 200 yards. And I think that I developed my skills as a hunter and my sort of character as a person in the attempt to do it a different way the next year and not to repeat sort of the sins of my past. And I'm sort of grateful that I didn't shoot it at 500 yards. Especially as a new hunter. As a new hunter, like if you've grown up with iron sights, you know, when you move to a scope, it's great. And if you've grown up with a scope, when you move to, you know, dialing, it's awesome. But if I had started with 500-yard shots, I'm not sure that I ever would have been driven, because hunting is hard. Even taking 500-yard shots or 1,000-yard shots, it's always hard, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure if I would have been driven to develop the same skills, and developing those skills, I think, made me a better person.
And that's an excellent point. With my own kids, the boys in particular have their 22s that they get to start their serious shooting career off, all iron-sighted. Because I want them to develop fundamental skills at shooting up close with challenging equipment. And then when they take even a 22 with a little dial and bolt action, you know, on the scope, and they're ringing targets at, you know, small targets at 100 yards, it's like a revelation to them. And sometimes those challenges, exactly like they did with you, push us to better ourselves. And that's a wonderful thing. Yeah, if you'd shot that elk and dropped her in the snow right there, it might have been too easy. Well, last day of the season, it wouldn't have been too easy.
It would have been too easy. I would have been ecstatic.
But you might have been overconfident. It might have led you to trying things you shouldn't have tried, and it certainly wouldn't have helped you build your close-range woodsmanship.